Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and organize around the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on in 2020. And what I want to do today is maybe talk about what we mean by eco-socialism, what's wrong with capitalism, and sort of outline a perspective on that, and then we'll get into questions and comments. And, we're in a situation now where we can't survive capitalism much longer. We need system change, not climate change or growing inequality or nuclear war, which sooner or later these wars are going to generate. And so I think we need to think about 5 inherent problems of capitalism. The first is its relentless growth destroys the environment. Relentless growth is built into the grow or die competitive structure of capitalism. If firms don't grow, they lose out in the competition. And that blind growth is destroying the ecological foundations of human civilization. Second problem, exploitation increases inequality and economic insecurity. Capitalism's wage-labor relationship exploits working people. It robs them of the full value of their labor and transfers that surplus value to the ownership class. So that generates growing inequality and economic insecurity. Third problem, dictatorship in the capitalist workplace undermines political democracy. Private economic tyranny generates political tyranny. So, wage labor, you don't have a say. Work is directed. You're servile order takers as a worker. And so on the job, we're stripped of our freedom. Our creativity is dismissed, and our self-worth is degraded. And this suppression tends to be internalized by workers and generates political alienation and apathy and more difficulty in taking on the political tyranny as well as the economic tyranny. Fourth problem, inequality and economic insecurity are made worse by capitalism's periodic and chronic economic crises. The profit motive between competing firms yields periodic crises of overproduction where capitalists they make excess capacity when they're trying to get profits as things are growing, and they end up with more inventory than they can sell. So they cut back on production and lay off workers, and we're in an economic crisis. And in today's mature capitalism, where the infrastructure of production is largely built out, we suffer from chronic stagnation due to chronic overproduction. The lack of profitable investments in the real economy of production generates a redirection of capital to financial instruments that further concentrate and centralize ownership of the productive assets we already have, rather than investing in the creation of new productive assets, because we don't need them. We already produce enough. So this financialization creates credit bubbles that draw wealth away as interest paid by productive businesses and consumers, and with public borrowing and privatization of public sector goods and services, we're getting a situation where debts cannot be paid. A financial crisis ensues, bankruptcies spread, and the financial oligarchy gets ahead anyway because they foreclose on the debtors and acquire more productive assets at bargain prices than they had before. So that just further increases the inequality, concentration of wealth. And so these economic crises are inherent to capitalism and generate more inequality and economic insecurity. And then fifth, capitalism's structure of competitive accumulation generates imperialism as different nation states, at the behest of their own giant corporations, go out and try to get more resources, markets, cheap labor, and geopolitical military advantage against rival capitalist powers. So that generates war. And sooner or later, these wars are going to end in nuclear annihilation if we don't change the system. A lot of people say, well, we're moving from a unipolar to a multipolar world, and that's good because US imperialism is diminished, but other imperialisms grow. It's a multipolar imperialism unless we change the whole system to a socialist system of cooperation and equality among nations. So we got to change the system between climate change and the threat of nuclear war. And then inequality kills. I mean, let's remember that a lot of people can't afford basic things: food, clothing, shelter, medical care. And the statistics showed the greater the inequality in a society, not necessarily the relative poverty, but the growing inequality generates lower life expectations for the people at the bottom of that economic hierarchy. So inequality is a life or death issue, like climate change and the threat of nuclear war. So we talk about an eco-socialist alternative to capitalism's environmental destruction, economic exploitation, political tyranny, and wars. So how do we get there? We have to understand that the two capitalist party system we have in this country protects the capitalist system. It gives us the illusion of choice. And while there are differences between the two major parties, particularly on social issues, they largely agree on pro-corporate economic and foreign policies to defend the capitalist system that confers privileges to the upper classes, who in turn fund the two major capitalist parties. So there's no point in having a Green Party or any third party on the left if it's not about system change. Otherwise, we're just tinkering with the system, and its inherent problems that I just outlined remain. There are plenty of progressives fighting inside the Democratic Party to patch up the systems with reforms. And those reforms don't really change the fundamental problems. And mostly those progressives lose because that party, the Democratic Party, is firmly in the control of the corporate leaders. So what the Green Party should be about, or any left party in this country, is about system change for an eco-socialism to bring real solutions to these life or death problems. When we look to talk about an eco-socialist economy, we're talking about building a democratic and cooperative economy in which a socialist mode of production and distribution predominates. We call it eco-socialism because the old socialisms of the 19th and 20th centuries focused on increasing production to solve the problem of poverty. Today, we have plenty of productive capacity. We can meet the material needs of all. So the problem today is to produce enough so that everybody's basic needs are met, but within ecological limits. So that's why we speak of eco-socialism. And I think we should envision eco-socialism, its economy, as an economy where we have a large sector of public enterprises, a large sector of cooperatives, and a smaller sector of small businesses and self-employed people. The public sector would encompass the giant semi-monopolies, roughly the Fortune 500, the 500 largest U.S. corporations that account for about 3/4 of our gross domestic product. So these public enterprises in the big industries would become public utilities, operating at cost for public benefit instead of cost plus profit by private owners. So public ownership of the major means of production would create the possibility for democratic planning of a plan of production that we meet everybody's needs, but within ecological limits. And that planning, which would be bottom-up democratic, would decide the technologies we use, solar power instead of nuclear power and fossil fuels, for example, and the allocation of investments in public goods and services like energy, transportation, housing, and healthcare. So it would be investment directed to meet the needs of people in harmony with the environment rather than the profits of the owners of these businesses. And then consumer goods and services would still be sold on the market by public enterprises, cooperative enterprises, and small businesses. So what we also could do with democratic planning once we, figure out how to produce enough so everybody's material needs are made, we can talk about, do we need to produce more things, or should we work less and increase our free time uh, at a decent standard of living? Now, for goods and services that are necessities, the public sector should provide them as public goods and services that are free to consume as needed in areas like healthcare, education, childcare, urban mass transit, or at low cost, like public housing, power, broadband, water, things like that. And we can decide which of those should be free and which are low cost through a democratic planning process. And for those wants and tastes that are discretionary luxuries, those goods and services would be sold on the market. But people who want to consume more would have to work more. And the people that used to be rich because they're living off the labors of others, exploiting their labor, would have to do real work if they wanted to, indulge in some of these discretionary luxuries. So that's the public sector. The private sector should be predominantly cooperatives because cooperatives eliminate exploitation, both in labor and in price gouging of consumers. So in worker cooperatives, the exploitative wage labor relation is eliminated because the worker owners receive the full value of their labor and decide how much to reinvest in the cooperative, how much to pay themselves. In consumer cooperatives, the consumer owners buy goods and services at cost instead of cost plus profits like private, consumer industry. And so the way to expand cooperatives, I would argue, should be the government should provide technical assistance and financial incentives. Transitioning from conventional private enterprises to cooperatives should be voluntary, not mandatory, because we can rely on the fact that cooperatives are a better way to work and to consume. And we should also have antitrust and anti-fraud laws to protect the self-employed and the small businesses and the farmers and the cooperatives from unfair competition by monopolies and white-collar crime, antitrust, anti-fraud. Now, that's a radical change, but we shouldn't give up the fight for what is right just because it's hard. And we don't have a choice, really, if the planet that can sustain a planet that can sustain human civilization is going to survive. So that's a brief case for why capitalism has to go and why we need eco-socialism. I actually based this on a essay I wrote 3 years ago, What's Wrong with Capitalism and Why We Need Eco-Socialism. And there's a link to that that'll go up in the chat. So hopefully that gives us some food for thought and discussion. So I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Amy L. Sachs. Lately, I've seen lefty advocates for nuclear, comparing it positively to the Ohio disaster. But the same corporate types who caused that disaster would likely be running the new nuke plants. Yeah, I mean, Ohio, the train disaster, I'm not sure the direct connection to the nuclear. I guess the connection is it would be the same business interests, or at least financial interests, investing in both the rail industry and the nuclear industry. We have had a disaster in Ohio. The Ohio legislature passed a law a few years ago providing subsidies for nuclear power plants. And it also provided subsidies for coal plants. And it turns out that the Speaker of the House was being bribed by the nuclear industry to do that. So they repealed that law because of that. But the last I heard, they're advancing, or maybe have already passed, a new law that provides those subsidies. I mean, nuclear is a disaster economically because it can't survive without subsidies. Not to mention the danger of catastrophic accidents like Chernobyl, Fukushima, We've had some really close calls in the U.S. 3 Mile Island was pretty bad. We almost lost Detroit from the Fermi reactor. I mean, we've had a lot of close calls. And the older these nuclear power plants get, the more brittle they become because of the radiation, and the more parts are likely to fail, and the nuke could fail, its cooling system could fail. And then going forward, and the Biden administration is pushing this in concert with the nuclear industry. I looked during the 2020 campaign. Biden was the only major politician or the only presidential candidate that got donations from the trade association of the nuclear industry. And I guess he's paying them back because his policy on energy is promoting nuclear power, which is insane. Nuclear power plants take too long to come online if it's going to be low carbon energy. It's not carbon free. I mean, there's a lot of, in the supply chains, there's a lot of carbon emissions to get to the nuclear plant and get it built. And because it takes too long, it's not going to reduce carbon in the near term. And economically, they keep failing. There are always cost overruns. For all that money, we could build a lot more power production in wind and solar and deep geothermal, which is getting more feasible. And so it's just a diversion of resources and a delay in time. So nuclear is a disaster, and we're getting a big push from it, from the industry and some people in the media who I think really don't understand the issue. And the industry's been buying off, one of the former leaders of Greenpeace, going way back, 40 years, has been a shill for the nuclear industry for decades. And they're picking up more people like that because they pay. So, this is a real diversion for what we need to do to deal with the climate crisis. And in the rail industry, the Green Party, at this point, it was something like 72-0, is about to pass a resolution calling for nationalizing the railroad industry under Democratic public control. Something I called for during the campaign. It's part of the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal. The Rail Workers United, or Railroad Workers United, which is a cross-union progressive caucus of rail workers, actually asked the Green Party to give them a resolution. They've got it from other unions and civic groups. So there's, and this accident in Ohio is just making that all the more relevant, because these accidents happen because they don't have enough staff. The equipment's getting old. They're just squeezing the industry for profits. The railroad industry was the most profitable industry in the country last year, something like 51% profit rate. It's billions and billions of dollars. This should be run as a public utility at cost, not for profit, and upgraded. I mean, we got a third world rail system in this country. It's not much improved from when I was born 70 years ago. And in a lot of ways, it's got worse. The passenger rail is much worse. So it's really time to push that to the fore. I don't know if there's legislation in Congress yet, but that's the next step. It's something we should be pushing. So Amy L. Sachs says, Howie, they were comparing pollutants caused by the railroad to that of the 3 Mile Island accident. Yeah, they're both dangerous. And the degree to which people were harmed, I don't think the number of people and animals that were harmed by the 3 Mile Island accident has really been acknowledged. There's been some writings about that that you can dig up. And this is, what I've heard it compared to is the toxic waste and air around the collapsed World Trade Centers on 9/11. And a lot of people were told who were first responders and construction workers who removed the debris and began to work there to build what replaced it. A lot of them got very sick, particularly with lung diseases. And the EPA said it was safe to go back when it wasn't. And so a lot of people think or worried that they will have the same problem in Palatine, Ohio, where this happened. B.D. Dimmitt. With the current and predictably worsening weather event situation, are nuclear power stations becoming an increasing threat simply because they weren't expected to have to stand up to the power and frequency of these cataclysms? Um, yeah, a tornado hitting a nuke could be a real problem. Uh, a hurricane, they're supposed to be built to withstand that, but as they get old, who knows? Earthquakes, I think, are the real thing, and that's not related to climate change. It's just something that comes. And some of these nukes, like the one out in California, Diablo Canyon, is built near a bunch of faults. And, it's supposed to have been shut down by now, but that damn Democratic governor of California, Gavin Newsom, uh, backed down on the agreement he came to with the industry and the unions in the industry to extend it in the name of carbon-free electricity, but they're risking a horrific uh, event. Meanwhile, Newsom went along with the power industry's uh, change in net metering so that people who install solar on their homes are getting paid less than the going rate or the rate they had before for the power they feed back into the grid, which is undermining the solar industry. So that's your lesser evil for you, the Democratic Party. They're talking about Newsom as a presidential candidate if Biden doesn't run. Um, so it's just not good enough for what we need. Private Content Boutique. Howie, what can we do to reverse the privatization trend? I keep asking Governor Gavin, but I don't think he wants to hear it. Yeah, I think, lobbying Gavin is not going to do as much good as building the Green Party. I think, in a state like California, you have nonpartisan local elections, a lot of local elections. It's where most of the Greens elected in the country are. And you build a political base from the bottom up so that, and hopefully we do this on a fast pace so that we begin challenging in the state legislature. If we had a Green caucus in the California legislature, it could really expose the Democrats. For example, on Medicare for All, a state version of that, uh, the Democrats said, well, we'll pass it when we get both houses in the governorship. And they've had that since they replaced Schwarzenegger. And now they can't find a way to pass it. If the Greens were in there, they'd have a public platform to really expose that and get people mobilized to put the pressure to move forward on that reform. And privatization, I think one way to reverse privatization is to push for socialization. For example, the PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, which is, has a horrible record of, its transmission lines causing forest fires, and equipment breaking down, gas line explosions, and I know I'm forgetting some other problems it's had recently. And that's a case where the stockholders want to squeeze as much profit out. So they don't maintain the system. They don't move to renewables as fast as they could because they want to use the old fossil fuel and nuclear generators as long as they can till they wear out. So maybe the best way to reverse the privatization trend is make the case for socialization of key things like healthcare, power, and I would say public education. I'm not sure what the charter situation is out there, but charter schools is the way they're trying to privatize public education. And it's a disaster. It's more a real estate business and a way for, crooks to come in and skim and scam to get public money into their own pockets than it is to provide education. I mean, it's another disaster where we need to push for education. Public money going to education should be spent in the public sector, not subsidizing these private charter schools. I know they call themselves public schools because they get public money. It's ridiculous. It's like calling Lockheed Martin a public enterprise because it gets most of its money from Pentagon contracts. It's a private enterprise. Private stockholders take profit out of it. They just get their money from government contracts. That doesn't make it a public enterprise accountable to the public. Scout Trooper 164. What do you think of the coverage regarding UFOs? I honestly don't care for it. Yeah, well, the cable news and the print media, they they're trying to sell advertising, get people to read their stuff. So they hype, these unidentified flying objects. It turns out the the last three were, and they haven't said exactly who, but were either research balloons or probably balloons from private enterprise or public agencies or universities. Um, and the big balloon that first brought people's attention was apparently a Chinese spy balloon. That's what they're saying from the wreckage they recovered. Um, but it wasn't the big national security threat that people think. I think there is an issue. They call it near space. It's unregulated. The Chinese seem to have been trying to exploit it for intelligence purposes. It's an area where, the U.S. and China and other countries that may be involved in this, Russia, India, who knows, we need to have regulations on near space, like we do to some extent on outer space, and have it regulated so that it's not being attempted to be used by different powers to gain military advantage. We had an open skies treaty with Russia and a lot of other countries where it enabled the different countries to do overflights to make sure that different countries were complying with their treaty obligations under arms control treaties. And the U.S. pulled out of that under the Trump administration. And Biden said he's not going to try to get back into it. And those are the kind of treaties we need. So, Reagan's famous thing, trust but verify, that verify is important. So you can have a treaty, but if you're not sure the other side is agreeing to it, that's not good. So I think, what I get from, this whole thing is near space is sort of a new area of military competition. And we need to have treaties to regulate, how that space is used. That's my reaction. I think the story's probably going to pass over unless there's a new wrinkle to it. My impression is that both China and the U.S. They were going to have meetings, and Blinken was supposed to go over there. The Secretary of State was supposed to go over there and talk to the Chinese, and he canceled that trip. But now they are going to have their meeting and try to get talking about some of the things we need to cooperate. I think Biden, his public position is we want competition. He means economic competition, but not confrontation. In other words, war. And I think that's fine. I think if I was president, I'd talk more about we need partnership and cooperation on climate, on arms control, and I don't know if you call it competition, but I think we should challenge them on their human rights record. It's horrible in Hong Kong and Tibet and with the Uyghurs out west, and this their basic political rights. That's something we can be critical of them about, but it should not preclude having discussions on these other issues. Christopher W. Howie, there's been some turmoil surrounding tomorrow's Rage Against the War Machine March in D.C. I was planning on attending. What are your thoughts about it? Well, first of all, I wouldn't attend it because they're calling for a cutoff of arms to Ukraine. You disarm Ukraine, what do you think is going to happen? The Russians are just going to, as they originally planned to do, take over the whole damn country. We need to be anti-imperialists. And, the first thing an anti-war demonstration should do, like these overwhelming resolutions that the United Nations have done several times and are going to do again on February 23rd, demand the immediate and full withdrawal of Russian military from Ukraine. So we should be in solidarity with the Ukrainians, not solidarity with the Russian aggressors. So that's the first demand of that demonstration. It's really the central demand. So that's my first problem. The second problem is if you go there, you will be marching with fascists like the LaRouche organization. Diane Sayre will be speaking for them. You'll be marching with right-wing libertarians, the Mises Caucus, which has taken over the Libertarian Party and is known for its racist and sexist commentary on public issues. Um, you know, those are not people we should be working. We should not be giving them platforms or legitimacy. So I think, tomorrow's demonstration, they call it a red-brown alliance, red being the left and brown being the far right. And that's historically a fascist tactic. Put some leftist populist slogans out there to try to broaden the base for a reactionary agenda. So I have a lot of problems with that demonstration. I will not be attending. Scout Trooper 164. Elon Musk wants to cut the Ukraine Starlink. What do you think? Yeah, Starlink is his company. It has been providing internet, the satellite connections for their internet, which is also used by their military. And what I've heard is he said that, but the Starlink is still working. What I think is Ukraine better look for a plan B because Elon Musk, who knows what the hell he's going to do minute to minute. I mean, he's as impulsive as Donald Trump, but he's a right winger like Donald Trump. And what he said about Ukraine is a lot of ignorant stuff about, basically repeating the Russian line. They're all Nazis. They're not really a nation. And, we shouldn't support them. So I think Ukraine should be looking for a plan B because I don't know how long they can count on Starlink. Howie, what do you think about the recent Seymour Hersh article, How America Took Out the Nord Stream Pipeline? Yeah, I read it, and I'm skeptical. First of all, he's only got one anonymous source for his very detailed description of how the U.S. and Norway, planned and carried out the alleged sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. But the thing that really bugged me about it is mixed in with that reporting about how the U.S. and Norway blew it up, according to one anonymous source, is a lot of narrative about why it was in the interest of the U.S. to do that. And I just knew, and not being an expert, that a lot of what he said is wrong in terms of the interests of Germany and the U.S. And I won't go into it in detail here because they're better sources, and I'll give you one in a minute. But, he says, and a lot of people have been quoting this, at a news conference, Biden said, if Russia invades Nord Stream, forget the exact words, it'll be taken out, something like that. But what people don't put is the context. The question was first asked of Scholz, the German prime minister. And Biden said that right in front of Scholz. Now, when I saw that at first, I said, well, that means Germany and the U.S. probably have agreed that if they invade, Germany's going to, not do the final approval of Nord Stream 2. Not that they were going to blow it up, but everybody takes that as an admission. Hey, I don't think you can take that as an admission of what they plan to do at all. And I don't have the link with me, but there's a socialist climate activist who is also a consultant to the gas industry to make his living, very familiar with Gazprom and Nord Stream 2 and all the gas and oil interlinks between Russia and Western Europe and the rest of Europe. He's also worked for a long time in solidarity with the labor movements of Russia and Ukraine. And he had an article out very quickly. He has a blog called People and Nature. And his name is Simon Pirani. That's Pirani. And he goes through the Hersh article and just shows how this narrative is wrong. Just factually wrong in what he said about the gas industry and how Hirsch's basic theme is the U.S. wanted to blow up the relationship between Germany and Russia, which is seen as a big national security threat to the U.S. And a number of people that have been apologetic for Russia's invasion have said that. He takes that apart. So the blog is called People in Nature. His name is Simon Pirani. This week, that article I'm talking about was at the top of his blog. It's also in New Politics, the left-wing publication. It's on their website. If you Google or use their search to get to Simon Pirani, I did that the other day. You actually have to go down because it doesn't come up at the top of the search I did. But you'll see an article about this. And I would suggest people look at that to get another perspective on what Hirsch put out. And then I saw Hirsch's Democracy Now! Interview about this. And, Amy Goodman and Juan Gonzalez were asking him questions, and he kept going off on tangents about, these narratives about geopolitics rather than about, the U.S.-Russia alleged, blowing up of the thing. And they had to keep bringing him back. And he kept putting out this narrative, which I think Pirani has shown is really off the wall. So I'm agnostic as to who blew it up. I don't think this shows or proves by any means that it was the U.S. and Norway. I'm not saying it wasn't them. And looks like Chris found the Simon Pirani article. Yeah, Challenging False Narratives. That's the article. So I suggest people check that out. And let's see what more reporting there is on this. It's really hard to follow up on Hirsch's article because he, doesn't give any indication of who the source was. Of course, Norway and the U.S. have completely denied it, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Doesn't mean it does. It just means we don't know a lot about, we don't have a lot of confirmed information about what happened, I guess the way I put it. Frankie Lee, Howie, the rich want to sell arms and war tech. How do we get them to spend on things like rail? Well, I don't think we'll get them. They'll go wherever the money's to be made. So what we got to do is change who's got the power. And that means getting Greens into office and redirecting public priorities away from the military-industrial complex into what should be a massive rebuilding of our infrastructure. So it's based on renewable energy and the efficient use of material, resources instead of, putting it into, waste dumps, have it recycled and reused. And but that's not going to happen because the rich aren't going to lead. We're going to have to expropriate their big properties, like I was talking about public enterprise. We can compensate them, but also have a much more progressive tax system, including a wealth tax and a financial transactions tax, so that the tax system begins to reduce the outrageous amounts of money that the super rich have. I think that's how we do it. I mean, we're not going to lobby the rich to do the right thing. We're going to have to take power from them. And, the way to start that is politically. We need an independent left party. The Green Party should be their party. And we just got to, start getting more of our people in office and also have more of what we're doing on the streets so that people see that we're fighting for these things. So it's a matter of organizing and building. And, right now the military industrial complex is sitting sweet. Military budget is growing. It's the biggest it's been since World War II, except maybe for a peak year or two after the, 9/11. I think it's more than any time during Vietnam or Korea. In any case, it's way more than we need for our defense, which is just a fraction of what we're spending now. I mean, I've been calling for, as a start, cutting the military budget by 75%, and using it mainly for home defense and having some forces available for, UN authorized interventions to stop aggression or genocide. But then that gets into UN reform. Right now, between the vetoes of, the U.S. on one side and Russia and China on the other, the UN really can't authorize anything. So the UN needs to be reformed. I have to say that one of the inspiring things about the left in Ukraine that is talking about what we need and talking to the left about it is we need to reform the United Nations, because right now it's in the hands of the big imperialists, not the hands of the world's people. So that's a big problem. I mean, you're basically asking, how do we change this damn system? And we got to. Scout Trooper 164, what do you think with the Great Salt Lake drying up? Yeah, that's a consequence of climate change and development in, well, I guess Utah's on the edge of the Great Basin and the Rockies, between the Great Basin and the Rockies, and there's so much development. They're using what water might have flowed into the Great Lake, as well as they're not, there's basically a drought in that area. And, this is a huge environmental change that is a consequence of climate change. So I hate to see it. I don't know what else to say about it. It's a symptom of, the big problems we face. Via email, did you hear that the officers who murdered Tyree Nichols pled not guilty? Yes, I did hear, and it's not surprising. Defendants, even when they're guilty, often plead not guilty and then hope to, bargain with the prosecutors. Something like 98% of cases are plea bargains, not going before a jury. So, that would be a, expected defense strategy. But I saw those videos; they were horrible to watch. And these guys were just acting like thugs. And apparently they killed Tyree Nichols, but he's not the only one that got the crap beat out of him by these guys. And this is one of those units they send into the high crime neighborhoods, usually Black or other ethnic minority. And they're not there to serve and protect. They're there to beat the crap out of people, frankly. And they, they get the attitude that they're above the law and they're the tough guys. And, in some cities, they say the police are the biggest gang in the city. So that gets back to, I think I talked about it last week, community control of the police until they work for us and not for the power structures of these cities. And the power structures, which is mainly the real estate industry, which is developers and banks and the lawyers that grease the wheels and so forth, they're the ones that fund municipal elections. And they profit from segregation by race and class. So the police police those segregated boundaries and basically act like an occupying military force in the poor, darker communities. And that's got to change. And we can, I think I was talking, I was talking about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, that would ban chokeholds and stop no-knock warrants and some other good reforms. But as I pointed out, we had a no chokehold law in New York for 20 years before Eric Garner was strangled to death in a chokehold. And that's because the police don't work really for the people; they work for the power structure in New York City. So the chokehold was being used, even though it was against the law, and nothing happened until Eric Garner ended up dead. So community control of the police, and we'll see how these trials go. But if they get off, it would be a travesty of justice, because it's clear, they just wanted to beat the crap out of this guy. Vicky Corden, DeSantis is overhauling education in Florida. It is being done with the wrong motives. Example, no Black history, etc. Your thoughts? What can be done? Yeah, the right talks about freedom, but they're banning books. They're spreading lies. They're trying to micromanage what happens in the schools, and they're coming from a place of either or both ignorance and mean spiritedness. So, what can we do? We got to be involved in school board elections and policy debates. Support our teachers and school boards that stand up to people like DeSantis. We need to call out DeSantis. We need to run candidates against him and his ilk. I'm not sure what the Democratic Party is doing down there in Florida, but I doubt they've really taken this head on. They've probably done some sniping, but they really don't have a plan of action. So yeah, we're education is a big fight now. I mean, it's been for a while. The privatization, the high stakes testing since what was the name of that law that passed under Bush? The forget the name, but that authorized more high stakes testing, which is a whole nother industry, and designed to uh, define schools that were underperforming as bad schools rather than as schools with more students from disadvantaged backgrounds who we expect to score lower on these standardized tests because they don't have the background to score well on those tests. And then they use those tests to define those schools as failing and bring in the charters to rip off the public and provide no better education than they were getting before in most cases. Most charters, on average, they don't do any better at educating than the public schools. So, we've got to be involved fighting over education, making it a right, not a privilege, for both preschool and childcare and also post-secondary education. Um, I think in Florida, if I'm not mistaken, they're pushing vouchers, which is another way to steal public money and hand it over to the private sector. So, what can be done? I think we got to be organized politically, make sure we focus on school boards as well as city councils. And then, we got to have people running against people like DeSantis because we can't count on the Democrats to do much better or to really, uh, take him on and expose his ignorance and his mean spiritedness. So, yeah, I keep coming back to the same answer. We need a movement to change who's in power. Via email. Did you hear that the officers who murdered Tyree Nichols pled not guilty? I think I just answered that one. Here's another one from email. Did you see the reporter who was arrested while trying to report on the Ohio train crash? I did not see that. And that's disturbing because uh, we need reporters to, tell us what's actually going on. I mean, I haven't followed it closely, but the impression I get is that what is it? Norfolk is the Southern Norfolk is the train company here that was responsible, and they're trying to cover up, how bad it is. They're trying to, get the rails going again before, uh, on that rail line before uh, it's really been cleaned up there. Um, so that's disturbing. If a reporter was arrested while trying to report, um, that should not be happening. Scout Trooper 164, how do you feel about Buttigieg ignoring major problems such as the Ohio train derailment? Yeah, Buttigieg is just an ambitious neoliberal politician. Superficial. His presidential campaign was that way. Um, his reward for, getting out of the race so everybody get behind Biden in South Carolina to cut off Bernie Sanders was he got a cabinet secretary position, transportation. Um, I'm trying to think. He's had problems with the airlines, now the railroads. Um, I think he could have been a stronger advocate for Build Back Better although I was very critical of that. It's a lot better than what we got. The so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which I call Build Back Badly. So I just wish Buttigieg would get out of the way. But again, that's why we need we can't rely on the Democrats or the Republicans to solve any of these problems. Scout Trooper 164, don't you just love it when the U.S. government wants to know everything we do, but doesn't want to release files of the JFK assassination from the vault? Pompeo is the dick. Yeah, I'd like to see all the files released, and that people's theories about who assassinated JFK. I don't know if we'll ever get that resolved, but maybe they're in those files they're keeping. And I don't have a particular theory. I have some thoughts. I've read some good books about it. I don't think Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. I think he was a patsy for the intelligence services, given his, history, going to the Soviet Union and, running around with the Hands Off Cuba Committee, but also talking with, right wingers and intelligence people. It's just very shady. I just think he might have been set up, or he was part of it, but not alone. But yeah, I'd like to see those released. And Pompeo, yeah, he's just an ambitious, pompous Pompeo, the pompous dick. I guess you could say that and be accurate. Via email, did you hear about 13-year-olds being found working overnight for a sanitation company? Didn't hear that particular one, but there's a lot of child labor and exploitation of immigrant labor going on in this country. A lot of wage theft from those workers. And that gets to what the hell is the Department of Labor doing? This guy Walsh is a deadbeat. Biden did give lip service to the PRO Act, the Protect Our Right to Organize Act. I got an email yesterday from the Teamsters saying, tell Congress to pass it. But I don't see any real move in Congress. In the House, the Republicans control it. So, our labor laws are in sorry shape, and they're hard to enforce, given who's in the agencies like the National Labor Relations Board. Although they're not so bad, but the Department of Labor is not being very aggressive, and Walsh is not being much of an advocate, if he's an advocate at all. So I haven't heard about this incident, but it doesn't surprise me because there's a lot of that going on. Via email, I hear you have a Ukraine panel this week. Yes, I do. I think it's Thursday night. There we go. And we're going to have a discussion on Ukraine with different perspectives with Matthew Ho, who recently ran for U.S. Senate from North Carolina as a Green and is a former Marine who was then working for the State Department, resigned from his position in 2009 when Obama surged in Afghanistan, and Ho thought that was just adding fuel to a fire, and we weren't helping the situation. And Margaret Kimberly, who's with the Black Agenda Report, and myself, and we do have different perspectives. So hopefully it will be a constructive discussion, and I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, Thursday at 8 p.m. And we should probably get the link in the chat. So yeah, there's a lot going on this week. I'll tell you more about it at the end in just a few minutes. Well, Chris is maybe giving me the signal I should wrap up. I did see Vicky Corden saying DeSantis is very vindictive to whoever disagrees with him. Disney disagreed with his anti-gay nonsense, and now Disney will probably be ruled by 5 appointees selected by DeSantis. I don't know about the latter part. My thing with people like DeSantis, he's very vindictive with whoever disagrees with him. But I would take, him being vindictive as an opportunity to hit him back. And that's what people didn't do with Trump. Those damn Republicans were spineless, and Trump just beat him up by calling him names. They didn't know what to do with the guy. And, Trump would just spew off in his minute or two in the debates a whole string of lies and made up stuff. And, they tried to be rational with him. I mean, the tactic to use there is pick out one of those lies and show how outrageous it was, and then say, that discredits your whole thing. You're acting like a fool. You're acting like a little kid. You got to hit back. And Disney, I don't know what the rule by 5 appointees selected by Disney means. Because I'm not, I've heard there's been conflict between Disney and DeSantis, and I'm just not familiar with the details. So I don't know what else to say about that. Scout Trooper 164. Pompeo is quite a guy to talk about Snowden endangering people's lives when he didn't report any U.S. secrets to the public, and the government loves to watch us. Free Snowden. Yeah, I agree. The U.S. should drop the charges, let Snowden come home. And he actually did release secrets. I mean, he released a secret surveillance program that we were unaware of, and the government had lied about not doing. He was a whistleblower. He didn't endanger any, people that were, spying for us. He had, people like Glenn Greenwald and others vet, all these documents he had. So I think he was responsible in releasing that information and did us a big service. And, some of the press organizations have recognized that. And the fact that, he's stuck there in Russia, given his penchant for freedom and a free press and whatnot, he must be chafing there because he can't do much, given the political system in Russia as a public citizen. He is taking citizenship, but that's, to protect the rights of his child. But he's not renouncing U.S. citizenship. Yeah, he's somebody that we should just drop the charges and let him come home. And as I said during the campaign, I would ask him to, if I was president, come into the government and help us develop policies to deal with surveillance and, regulating the internet in a way that facilitates communication without censorship and also prevents abuse. I think he's got the background to give good advice on that. So I guess it's time to wrap up. So we already talked about the discussion we're having Thursday night, which is one day before the anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There's some other events that I'd like to urge people to participate in. The Ukraine Solidarity Network is hosting an event next Saturday at 2 p.m. It goes for an hour and a half, which bleeds over my time. I'll be here at 3, even though I'm delivering a 1-minute solidarity statement as part of that event. It's called Russia Out, Solidarity with the Ukrainian Resistance. And it'll be online. And the speakers are 2 Ukrainian socialists, Yulia Yushchenko, who was on this podcast last September, Vladislav Starodepstov, another Ukrainian socialist who, Yulia's from Vinnytsia, which is in central Ukraine. I understand Veroslav is from Donbass. And so he has a perspective there. And then a Russian socialist named Kirill Medvedev, who just went into exile. He's a member of the Russian Socialist Movement, a well-known poet and political writer in Russia. And then Kavita Krishnan, who is a socialist feminist in India, who is a member of the political committee or Politburo of the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist Liberation. There are three big communist parties in India. The whole left is in one of those communist parties. And she got disgusted with their lukewarm solidarity with Ukraine and their lukewarm criticism of Russia. And they were the best in that regard of all of those three communist parties. So she's broken away. And then, those are the four international speakers. And then we'll have Bill Fletcher Jr. moderating. So that's next Saturday, sponsored by the Ukraine Solidarity Network. And then there was actually a podcast a couple of days ago, Thursday, called Against Multipolar Imperialism, an Internationalist Response. And it included Kavita Krishnan, who I just talked about, Promise Lee, who is a Hong Kong native and pro-democracy activist, now in Los Angeles, given the situation, but active in the left of the Democratic left in the Chinese diaspora. And Romeo Kokriatsky, who is, he's got a podcast out of Ukraine called Ukraine Without Hype. He's a socialist, a journalist. He's actually born in Ukraine, but grew up in the Bronx and went back to Ukraine. So he's got an interesting perspective. That discussion is very good. It's hosted by Joey Ayub, who's a Lebanese leftist, and he has a regular podcast called The Fire of These Times. So that's the second one. And then the third one, this already happened. This was January 31st. This is another event that the Ukraine Solidarity Network set up, and it was on the Real News Network. It was called Solidarity with Ukraine from the Global South. And it had Vladislav Starodubstov, who will be on the Saturday podcast, the Syrian-American activist Rama Kudaimi. If you've been active on the left around the Syria question and the Palestinian question, you should know her. And then Rafael Bernabe, who was elected in 2020 to the Puerto Rican Senate, representing a new left third party called the Citizens Victory Movement. And he in particular in that, it was very articulate, I think, in laying out the issues of how we practice international social solidarity. So I hope those went into the chat. Looks like they did. Yep, okay. So there are some things to look at this week as we contemplate a year of this war in Ukraine and what we can do to bring this war to an end that's just for the Ukrainians and enduring for world peace. And that's a difficult question. And I just hope we have more constructive discussion than name calling, which we've had a lot of. I've been on the receiving end of a lot of it. I don't care. I'm comfortable with my position and I'll defend it. But that kind of name calling is divisive. It's not constructive. And at best, it's politically immature. And at worst, it's designed to divide us. So we got to stay away from that. So I hope everybody has a good week. If you're wondering, my broken ribs, there ended up being 5 of them, are healing fast. I'm feeling good. And I hope everything's going well with you. And we'll see you next week at the same time. Take care.